Good morning. We're going to get started. It's a little different format. Instead of doing a lecture or screening a film or something, we're just going to have some Q&A, some conversation with Sam, and some of you were good enough to send me questions ahead of time, so we're going to use those first and see how far they get us, and I may have another one or two to put into the mix, and we'll see where we are on time, but we'll do this for about half an hour or so thank you for coming. I'll just start with the first question. So someone is wondering if you might comment on the role of gentleness in the fractious political environment. They specified in America, but I think there's also a fractious political environment in the UK as well. So.
No, I don't know anything about any problems in the UK. I think it's all going fantastically well at the moment. Well, I think I've always been struck by Jesus' line in the Sermon on the Mount, let your yes be yes and let your no be no. And I remember when I first started in public speaking, people told me about the famous marginal note, argument weak, hear shout. And so when I'm actually going to Holland, Michigan this evening, and I've been to preach there twice, and the second time I went, the dean of the chapel introduced me to a student who said, this student's got something to tell you about your preaching style. And I thought, oh, okay. And he said a really interesting thing I've never forgotten. I'm telling you about it 15 years later, which was when you get to the crucial point in your sermon, you get quieter rather than louder. Is that deliberate? And I said, well, I've never really realized, actually. But actually, I'm quite pleased you said that, because I think that's a good thing. Somehow the shoutier we get, the less trustworthy are the things we say. And the people I respect are the people that are able to say it just once, in one simple sentence. Neil Kinnock isn't a name that probably doesn't mean much to many of you here, but he was the leader of the Labour Party in the UK in the 1980s. And he took over when the Labour Party was in about as much of a mess as the Conservative Party currently is. So that's telling you something. And I heard him, he became an EU commissioner, one of the bureaucrats, I suppose, that runs the European Union. And I heard him on a phone-in, and he said, the caller said, how come when there was a referendum about membership of the European Union in 1975, you voted against, and now you've ended up as an EU commissioner, so you're a hypocrite, aren't you? And I never forgot what he said. He said, when I realize I'm wrong, I change my mind. What do you do? And it takes a certain assertive gentleness to be able to say something like that. And I aspire to that assertive gentleness. I guess the other thing I should say, one or two of you know this, but when I was a 20-year-old, I was playing in a rugby match and got badly injured, had to breathe through my throat for a couple of weeks with a tracheotomy. And since then, I've never been able to shout. I didn't bother telling the student in Michigan this. But I guess I've had to develop other ways to assert myself. And I find that keeping my head still and speaking slowly and only saying something once works for me. So I guess I've developed a kind of gentleness, but it's partly circumstantial. But that's what I'm looking for in other people, is the ability simply for your yes to be yes and your no to be no. And also to be able, and I know this may be a new thing in American political advertising, but to be content to say what kind of world you want your policies to bring about and what it's going to cost not just in money, but in other ways to get there, rather than to find out salacious details about your opponent's previous life and make them arguments in favor of your vision. I know that's a bit of a new concept in American political advertising, but I do commend it to you.
Thank you. You can tell that this one was probably submitted by, I think, from someone in the Being With group based on how it's worded. Okay. I wonder what being with Jesus means to you. I wonder how simply knowing that you are with Jesus has helped you to be with others.
What a wonderful wondering. That's not really a question at all, is it? Those of you who are familiar with Being With will know that I insist that a sentence that begins with "I wonder" is not a question. It's an invitation to a deeper shared understanding. Well, I guess I was talking about that in the sermon this morning. To me, one of the most helpful things anyone said to me about the life of faith was Rowan Williams, actually the former Archbishop of Canterbury. And he said, if it's ever not happening for you and things seem dry or Jesus doesn't feel meaningful to you, go and hang out with someone for whom Jesus is alive. And the chances are it will be a person either in a much poorer economic situation or a person who's been through significant tragedy. So, as you probably understand, I chose to preach on the Beatitudes because I was coming to a place that met those criteria, that you're living the Beatitudes at the moment. So I've come here to renew my faith by being with you. And that's been borne out in my life experience, is that when you're isolated and things aren't happening for you, you can feel sorry for yourself and it can become a bit of a downward spiral. But there's nothing better than getting out of yourself by getting close to somebody whose challenges in life are greater than yours. I've never been through anything like what you've been through together, and I've been renewed by being with you. So thanks for having me.
How can the violence and depression in the Bible be reconciled with a God of love?
So if you look at the violence in the Bible, a lot of it would be interesting to do a sort of a spot map of where the kind of really uncomfortable passages are, and they're mostly in Joshua and Judges, to be honest. There's a little bit in the first 5 books of the Bible, and there's quite a lot of people wiped out towards the end of the book of Esther. But on the whole, it clusters around those 2 books. And the way I have come to understand this, and again, those who are familiar with the Being With course will kind of recognize this way of thinking, is that it seems to me the crucial moment in the writing of the Old Testament is when the people of Israel went into exile in Babylon. They lost, and they were carted off 500 miles to the east. And a number of very important things happened. One of them was that they actually wrote down their story significantly to understand how they'd got into such a mess. And that's what we know as the Bible. That and if they hadn't gone to Babylon, they might never have written down the Bible. But even more importantly than that, what they discovered in exile was that paradoxically, they were closer to God than they'd ever been in the Promised Land. They saw a different face of God. And crucially for Christianity and for the early church, that insight that they were closer to God in their suffering, and even more crucially in God's suffering, than they had ever been in times of plenty, what proved fundamental in the disciples understanding the cross as being the fullest revelation of who God was, and at a time of profound pain and loss and agony. But what that means in relation to war is that the way I understand it is that in the early part of the Old Testament, for the most part, Israel's understanding of God was what I'd call a God of four. God's job was really to fix a bunch of stuff for them. And what they discovered in exile was a God of with, a God that was with them even through their worst times. And you know how it is, all of us, a lot of the time, would quite like a God of four. There's quite a lot in the world we'd like God to fix. And the God of four clearly fixes things in very dramatic ways. And almost all of those violent passages are ones where Israel is the mouse and the opposition is the elephant. And so the sheer glee, they're almost sort of caricatured glee of Israel rejoicing as the opposition is defeated. And if you remember how these stories came to be cherished, people didn't, on the whole, read in those days, so these stories were told, around campfires, as it were. And you can imagine people almost cheering as the baddies are defeated and the goodies prevail against all the odds. But the way I think we can read them is to see that this was a progression in Israel's understanding of God, to the point where in the exile, about 550 years before Christ, they discovered a God, what I call a God of with, a God who was with them. And to me, the painful paradox is that the church still faces the same challenge to understand a God of with, when the most popular versions of Christianity, for understandable reasons, present God as a God of four. Either a nationalist God who chooses a favorite country. I can't possibly imagine which country we might be talking about, but the country I grew up in and the country most of you grew up in have both at different times in history taken this view that they were God's most favored nation. So the God of four either chooses a most favored country, and that God's job is to, destroy everything in that country's path, or you get a sort of justification for a kind of righteous violence on behalf of that God. And both of those, it seems to me, are the kind of pre-exile Israelite faith. And they're not modeling what I see as the exilic faith of Israel, which came to see that in suffering, God was with them like never before.
This is sort of a statement and a couple questions. I love the value of wisdom. I seek it, but I cannot grasp it for long. How does one get to the state of wisdom, or is there such a state? Is the seeking of wisdom what God calls us to do?
What a lovely set of comments and questions. I think in lots of ways the seeking of wisdom is what God calls us to do. The question is, where is wisdom to be found? And I think there's more than one kind of wisdom, but the 30 years of being a pastor have taught me that wisdom is often to be found. I sound a bit like a broken record here, but amongst those who have been through the most in life, who yet come to be gracious, gentle, to use the word in the first question, merciful, and all the words in Galatians 5, loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, gentle, and so on. So that's the thing about where I think wisdom is most to be found, and it tends to be amongst people who've been through the most in life and found the truth. So again, to go back to what I was saying in the sermon this morning, the difference between the urgent and the important. For those people who've identified what's important and stick with what's important and rededicate themselves to what's important every day, when a community goes through a crisis like you've all been through, that person stands out because they still think the same thing is important, and it still is, whereas everybody else has never been in a situation like this before, and their mind and their heart are just scrambled. So that's where I think wisdom is most to be found. But I think there can be various kinds of wisdom. I mean, clearly, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer in the United Kingdom needs a lot of wisdom. But that's a very different kind of wisdom from the wisdom, say, of the farmer and the farmer's dog as they round up the sheep each day. That's the kind of wisdom I'm talking about. Is really the farmer and the sheep. But there are other kinds of wisdom, and I think a lot of us come back to those words in Ecclesiastes about a time to die, and a time to live, and so on, and a time to speak, and a time to refrain from speaking, and that's a word that leads to a kind of wisdom that is unfashionable in a church like St. Stephen's and a church like my own church of St. Martin's, and that word is judgment. And judgment is another word for discernment, really. And I think life can teach us that, but prayer teaches that more than anything else, because prayer is our openness to seeing the world from God's point of view. And that's where wisdom fundamentally comes from.
I heard a sermon that you gave on Easter this year, and at the beginning of the sermon, you talked about how someone said that it must be hard to be a vicar at Easter because everyone likes Christmas better. Do you remember that? Yeah. So, and you kind of go from there and talk sort of about what a Christmas type of faith person, whatever, versus an Easter kind of fresh out of the wrapping paper versus saved from the abyss type of situation. I wonder if you would expound on that for them who may not have heard the sermon.
Wow. I've been asked some difficult questions in my time, but can you remember the sermon you preached 6 months ago? Is one of the hardest. I think you better answer this yourself. I'll have a go. So I guess we are a Christmas and an Easter people. I often say that Christmas is really a nighttime occasion because it all happens in the dark with the shepherds and so on. And Easter is really an early morning celebration because it all happens, at crack of dawn. But I think you summarized it really beautifully just then, that Christmas has that sort of fresh wrapping, and Easter has that endurance through the ghastliness until the dawn comes. And Easter, of course, it means different things when different people speak of it. For some people, it includes Good Friday and the Holy Week, and for some people, it's just Easter Day. So, did you want to...
To include Good Friday through Easter Sunday. Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, I think that's how it was meant when you originally talked about it, in the sense of why, to go back to whoever said it to you about why it must be harder to be a vicar on Easter than Christmas, in terms of to preach into that and to lead people through that Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday versus Christmas.
Well, Rebecca and I were talking yesterday, and I talked about a wedding that I'm going to be taking on Saturday, and it's a wedding. I don't know if the couple will be watching this right now. I suspect possibly not. So I'll tell you a bit about them. For both of them, it's a second marriage, and for both of them, the first marriage didn't turn out the way they would have hoped. It's not an unusual story. Christmas is a bit like the first marriage, and not because it goes horribly wrong. You get me? But because there is a simplicity about it. There is Christmas is the fundamental statement of God saying to us, I only want to be with you. God's whole life is shaped to be in relationship with us. That's what Christmas is saying. Christmas is in some ways the first day of the universe, because if you believe, as I do, that the universe was created so that God could be with us in Christ, God is fundamentally with us on Christmas Day for the first time. And so in that sense, it's like the first marriage. This is God's statement of, I have no desire to be except to be with you. Easter is the second marriage because Good Friday is the first story going horribly wrong. God still is saying, I have no desire to be except to be with you, but humanity is saying in return, no thanks. No, not just no thanks, but we're going to nail you to a cross. That's as big a no thanks as you could possibly get. Not actually thanks, actually. Doesn't enter into it very much. And yet, Easter is God coming back for more and saying, I'm not going to be put off by your rejection of me. I'm going to make this offer again. I had a couple, this is not the couple I was talking about, but I had a couple sitting on what I call my wedding sofa in marriage preparation some while ago. And I asked the question because one of them had been previously married. I said, as I tend to say to all people in that situation, I have to ask you this question. Given you've seen how awful marriage can be, how come you're sitting on this sofa next to this lovely person and proposing to do it again? I think you have, as the pastor, you have to ask that question. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to answer it. So what the two of them talked about on the way home is beyond me, because there's only one answer to that question. It's, because I've met you, darling. So I wanted to send her out the room and say, you're supposed to say, because I've met you, darling, and then we'll bring her back in and let's do that again. But I didn't. I've never forgotten it. I mean, as you can tell by telling you about it now, it was so poignant. That's the longest I've sat in silence with a couple. And I think he was getting in touch with how truly awful it had been. But in that sense, I think Easter is the second, is in a sense, that's God on my sofa saying, given you've seen how awful humanity can be in relation to you, how come you still want to be in relationship with us? And Easter is saying, I do, and I have no desire to be anywhere else. And that's why for me, Christmas is the festival of God being with us, but Easter in some ways is even more special because it's being with us knowing how awful we can be.
Like him saying, I want to be with you anyway,
Yeah.
in spite of all that.
It's a different song.
Right, it is. Anyway. So people might be interested to know, even though when Queen Elizabeth died, I guess a few weeks or a month ago, that while the service wasn't at St. Martin in the Fields, because of where you are in central London, your church became kind of a focal point for people wanting to find a place to reflect on that and pray. And I think it would be interesting for people here to hear from you about how that was for your church, and sort of also kind of what it felt like for all of a sudden for people throughout UK to have this sort of moment of faith and spirituality and a renewed attention to such things on a national level.
So someone said to me last night that people in the Diocese of Alabama call St. Stephen's Mr. Stevens because you like informality and you don't take yourself so seriously as some other places. And I love that. I'm going to go back and tell people about that. And I think St. Martin in the Fields is a little bit like St. Stephen's in that way, because we are wedged between Westminster Abbey at one end in the city of Westminster and St. Paul's Cathedral at the other end of the Strand in the city of London. And in some ways, what you saw, and I imagine a lot of you saw the funeral, and it was exhausting to watch. I felt completely exhausted by the time I'd finished. And what you saw in that funeral was a carefully orchestrated portrayal of the British Constitution, with the monarch supported by the military. There was a lot of military involved, as you probably noticed, and Parliament, and blessed by the church. And that's kind of what the whole ceremony portrayed. But there was an awful lot of marching up to the top of the hill and marching back down again. It was really very heavy. And St. Martin's, I guess, tries to position itself as something that goes a little bit more to the heart, and it doesn't take itself quite so seriously. I mean, you have to say those services took themselves quite seriously. That we don't take ourselves quite so seriously. And so I guess what we were offering people was a way to make a more human response. And because what happened, as will always happen, I guess, and perhaps happened with you in the summer, was that one kind of grief takes the lid off other kinds of grief and puts you in touch with profound sadness in your life that may be nothing to do with the Queen, but actually you need a space that, this triggers you to get back in touch with that. So I think there was a lot of that at St. Martin's, and we had hundreds and hundreds of people every day for those 10 days. And it was a great time for volunteering for our community. Our stewards, came out of the woodwork, and the church was open all the time. I mean, the church is always open all the time, but there were lots of visitors, so there were lots of our own congregation who volunteered to talk to people and be available to people and help them light a candle, all that kind of thing. And the day itself was just really special, because we put up a huge screen, hundreds of people watched together, the majority of whom hadn't intended to come to St. Martin's, but had intended to watch the funeral on the Mall or somewhere like that. And it was intimidating, the amount of security and boards that were put up, and it was made it extremely difficult to get anywhere close. So they came down to our crypt and watched on a big screen together. And afterwards, a Turkish woman said to me, I want to know more about the faith that made such a beautiful woman. And I thought that was my highlight of the whole day, that somehow we'd provided a space for people to digest and process the big grand events that were happening half a mile away.
I think a big difference, even though we're all in the Anglican communion together, a difference between where you are in the Church of England and for us here in the Episcopal Church in the United States is that we're not the established religion of our country, whereas there's establishment. And I was reading the other day that someone was threatening disestablishment, a member of Parliament, which I guess gets probably threatened from time to time. Do you think that's ever likely, that the Church of England, that there would be disestablished as the church?
It's not something that I lose any sleep about. I know I have friends and colleagues who think we should be disestablished because you can't be a faithful church if you're sucking up to the powers that be. I think having the bishops in the House of Lords is a bit of an anomaly, but actually the other faiths all like it. And you don't get any opposition from any other faiths about having the Anglican bishops in the House of Lords, which is curious. So it's a kind of a fight that nobody wants to have, it seems to me. No one's really cross about the status quo, not many people. However, there are two things I think that probably won't outlast my lifetime. We'll see. The House of Lords itself is not an elected body like your Senate, and the monarchy is a bit of an anomaly. I happen to think it's a better system than most of the others available around the world. I'm not going to make any comment on any particular political system, but I think to have a non-elected head of state who provides a continuity and a check and a balance on an elected head of state who in almost no case will get more than 50% of the vote and often a lot less, and yet will act quite intemperately sometimes. I think it's a good system. So I suppose what I'm saying is that as was very visible in a lot of the ceremonies leading up to the funeral of the Queen, the establishment of the church is at the heart of the Constitution. So unpicking it, I think, would be quite difficult. But whether in my children's lifetime there will be a transformation in the Constitution of the UK, and that can well involve Scotland becoming independent. Who knows what might happen to Northern Ireland, especially now that Catholics are the majority in Northern Ireland, which is a subtle thing that changed in the last few months. Not many people noticed, but I think it was a very important moment. And Wales, our country could have a different name very soon. It could have a very different constitution. Unpicking Scotland from the rest of the UK will be much harder than unpicking Britain from Europe, which proved hard enough. There's a lot of things that are all mixed up with each other, which is why I think nobody with any sense is really eager to do this. But I think most of it will inevitably happen, and I think the establishment will disappear at the same time. But what's most important to me about the establishment of the church is not that we get to take the Queen's funeral. It is that the Church of England has something very precious that very few churches have, that we have a commitment to care for every single person in our country. And whereas in the Episcopal Church, I'm going to caricature this, but you'll recognize what I'm saying. If people have certain views on certain issues and they don't fit in with St. Stephen's, the clergy always have the option of saying, I think you're going to want to go to the Baptists up the road, or shall we say. And a Church of England clergy person, an incumbent or a rector or a vicar, it's against the DNA of the Church of England to say that. You have come to us, you have views that contrast with most of the people in our community. We need to find a way to embrace you. And that's a whole different mindset. And that, to me, is what the establishment of the Church of England really means, is that everybody in the nation belongs to the church, even if they're a Muslim, even if they're a declared atheist. They all belong in the Church of England. And I think that's a great, great tradition of incarnational presence, which I don't see in most of the other churches, and certainly I don't see in North America.
I think the last question is a follow-up on your talk last night. If you had to recommend 2 or 3 things that might be helpful for people here at St. Stephen's to read, besides the copy of the lecture that we'll send out to people, but like things that other people have written that you think would be meaningful for people to ponder and reflect on as we continue to process 4 months out.
Well, immodestly, I did write a little book called Love Mercy, which I think you even possess, because I think you told me that. And I know John does, because I think I signed one for him at the conference. So that was my best attempt to distill most of my thoughts around this area. I've now forgotten the name of the book that came first to mind when you just asked me that question. I read a book by a Holocaust survivor who lived up until the 90s. No. No, it's not by. She's not become famous particularly, and I honestly can't remember the name of the book. But when I get back to London, I'll probably try and be in touch and send you the name of the book. It's a very simple story, really. But what she tells in that story is that she was only 8 or 12 years old when she was in Auschwitz, and she survived. But what she vividly shows at every subsequent point in her life is that she had a choice between bitterness or grace, between judgment or mercy. And she was describing, just like our wonderful presentation on stewardship, I thought it was wonderful, that line in our presentation on stewardship this morning that said, "You're not doing this for God, you're doing this for you." And I thought, hallelujah, that's exactly the way to talk about stewardship. And in this book, I felt the same, hallelujah. She's not using language of forgiveness particularly. She's not using the big words like reconciliation. She's just saying, I could let this story, this part of my life, scar me and sour me and poison me, or I could make it sort of stimulate me even more to be a person of grace and mercy. And she tells very movingly in the book about how at each stage she had chosen grace, chosen mercy, rather than judgment and rejection. And but it's terrible to tell something like that and then be able to say, I can't remember her name. But maybe that's symbolic in a strange way. Anyway, I shall try to send it through to you guys, and I do recommend it to you. It's a very simple story. It's not a challenging read, but it left a very big impression on me.
I think we heard the bell, so it means we're out of time, and some of us have to get to the next service. But thank you all for coming, and thank you, Sam, for answering our questions.